Sarah Martinez walked into the veterans meeting hall with steady steps, but her heart was racing. She carried an old worn glass case in her weathered hands. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly as she made her way to an empty chair in the back row. Around her, dozens of former soldiers chatted loudly about their service records. Most were men, their voices booming as they shared stories of combat zones and military honors. Sarah listened quietly, clutching her glass case closer to her chest. "Look at the old lady with her antique," whispered Tom Bradley, a former Marine corporal. His voice carried further than he intended. Several heads turned toward Sarah, their eyes landing on the glass case she held so carefully. The case itself looked unremarkable. It was made of simple wood with a glass front, the kind you might find at any thrift store. The wood had scratches and dents from years of handling. The glass was slightly foggy, making it hard to see what was inside clearly. "Probably some old family photos," laughed another veteran, Mike Stevens. He had served 2 tours in Iraq and never missed a chance to mention it. "My grandmother had one just like it." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks but said nothing. She had heard comments like this before. At 62 years old, she was used to people making assumptions about her. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a simple bun. She wore plain clothes and rarely spoke about herself. The meeting began with the usual introductions. Each person stood up and shared their name, branch of service, and years served. When it came to Sarah's turn, she stood slowly. "Sarah Martinez," she said in a quiet but clear voice. "United States Army, 2002 to 2018. A few people nodded politely, but she could see the skeptical looks. 16 years of service was impressive, but she looked more like someone's grandmother than a combat veteran. "What did you do in the Army?" asked Tom, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would be something mundane. "I served where they needed me," Sarah replied simply, sitting back down with her glass case. The snickers were barely hidden. Sarah could hear the whispered comments around her. Probably a desk job. Maybe she worked in the mess hall. 16 years of filing paperwork. After the official meeting ended, people gathered in small groups. Sarah remained in her seat looking at her glass case. She traced her finger along its worn edges, remembering the day she had first put her most precious possession inside. Jennifer Walsh, a young Army veteran who had lost her leg in Afghanistan, wheeled her chair over to Sarah. Unlike the others, she had noticed something in Sarah's eyes during the introductions. It was the same look she saw in her own mirror sometimes, the weight of memories that couldn't be shared easily. "That's a beautiful case," Jennifer said genuinely. "What's inside?" Sarah looked up, surprised by the kind tone. Most people who asked about her case did so with barely hidden mockery, but Jennifer's eyes held real curiosity and respect. "Something important," Sarah answered carefully. She had learned not to share too much too quickly. "I bet it is," Jennifer smiled. "Would you like to get some coffee?" "There's a quiet place across the street." Sarah hesitated. She had come to these meetings for months but had never socialized afterward. The other veterans made it clear she didn't fit in with their image of what a real soldier looked like. "I don't want to bother you," Sarah said. "You wouldn't be bothering me at all. I could use the company of someone who understands." They made their way to the small coffee shop across from the meeting hall. Sarah moved slowly, still holding her glass case with both hands. She never let it out of her sight. The coffee shop was nearly empty. They found a corner table away from the windows. Sarah placed her case on the table but kept her hands resting on top of it protectively. "You know," Jennifer said as they waited for their coffee, "some of those guys back there think they know everything about military service." "People see what they want to see," Sarah replied quietly. "That's true. But I've learned that the people who talk the least often have the most interesting stories." Sarah studied Jennifer's face. There was wisdom there that came from real experience, not just talk. She was probably 30 years younger than Sarah, but her eyes held the same kind of depth. 16 years is a long career," Jennifer continued. "You must have seen a lot of changes in the Army." "The Army changed and so did the wars," Sarah said. "When I started, everything was different. After September 11th, everything changed again." Their coffee arrived, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Sarah could feel Jennifer's genuine interest, but she still wasn't ready to share her full story. "I joined when I was 22, Sarah finally said. "My family thought I was crazy. Girls from my neighborhood didn't join the Army. What made you do it?" "I wanted to serve my country." It sounds simple, but it wasn't simple at all. Jennifer nodded. The best reasons usually aren't simple. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and glanced down at her case. Inside, barely visible through the foggy glass, was a single military medal. But it wasn't the medal itself that mattered most to her. It was what that medal represented, a moment in time that had changed everything. That case means a lot to you, Jennifer observed. More than most people would understand. Try me. Sarah looked up, meeting Jennifer's eyes. For the first time in months, she felt like someone might actually listen without judgment. The men back there, they think they know what real service looks like, Sarah said slowly. They think because I'm an older woman, I must have had an easy job. A safe job. But that's not true. No, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. It's not true at all. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass case again. Inside, that metal caught the light for just a moment. Would you like to know what's really in here? Sarah asked. Jennifer leaned forward slightly. Only if you want to tell me. Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time since she had started attending these veterans meetings, she felt ready to share her truth. Sarah carefully lifted the glass case and turned it toward Jennifer. In the better light of the coffee shop, Jennifer could see through the foggy glass more clearly. Inside was a single military medal, but it wasn't like any medal she had seen before. That's a silver star, Jennifer said softly, her eyes widening with recognition. Yes, Sarah nodded, but that's not the whole story. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor in combat. Jennifer knew that much from her own military training. It wasn't something given out lightly. You had to do something extraordinary under enemy fire to earn one. Sarah, do you know how rare these are? Jennifer asked. Especially for women. Sarah finished the sentence. Yes, I know exactly how rare they are. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the case. She had carried this secret for so long that sharing it felt both terrifying and liberating. The men in that meeting room, Sarah continued, they assume that because I'm a woman, because I'm older, I must have served in some support role. They think I spent 16 years cooking meals or processing paperwork. But you didn't. No, I didn't. I was infantry. Then later, special operations. Jennifer nearly dropped her coffee cup. Female infantry soldiers were incredibly rare, especially when Sarah would have been serving. The military had only recently opened all combat roles to women officially. How is that possible? I thought women weren't allowed in infantry units back then. Sarah smiled for the first time that evening. It was a sad smile, full of memories that were both proud and painful. Officially, we weren't. But wars don't always follow official rules. When they needed people who could do the job, they found ways around the regulations. She opened the case carefully, as if it contained something that might break. The silver star gleamed under the coffee shop lights. Attached to the medal was a small handwritten note card. May I? Jennifer asked, gesturing toward the note. Sarah nodded and slid the case across the table. Jennifer read the small card, her expression changing from curiosity to amazement. The note was written in faded ink. For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez. Long-range precision engagement. Distance 4,200 meters. Confirmed kill. Operation Enduring Freedom. Afghanistan, 2010. Jennifer looked up at Sarah, her mouth slightly open. 4,200 meters? That's over 2.5 miles. 2 miles and 600 yards to be precise, Sarah said quietly. Sarah, that's impossible. That would be one of the longest confirmed sniper shots in military history. The 5th longest, actually. At least it was in 2010. Jennifer stared at the older woman across from her with new eyes. This quiet, unassuming woman who had been ridiculed and ignored at the veterans' meetings was apparently one of the most skilled marksmen in military history. I don't understand, Jennifer said. Why isn't this public knowledge? Why aren't you famous? Sarah took a sip of her coffee, buying herself time to think about how to explain. The story was complicated and parts of it were still classified. Because in 2010, women weren't supposed to be in combat positions. Officially, I was listed as a combat support specialist. My real job was never in my official records. So how did you end up as a sniper? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as she remembered those early years. I grew up hunting with my father in Montana. I could outshoot my brothers by the time I was 15. When I joined the Army, my marksmanship scores were off the charts. But they put me in logistics because that's where women belonged. How did things change? September 11th changed everything. Suddenly, the military needed every skilled person they could find. There were informal programs, special units that operated outside normal regulations. If you could do the job, they didn't care what your official designation was. Jennifer was fascinated. She was hearing about a side of military history that was rarely discussed. I was recruited for a special operations unit in 2008, Sarah continued. We did long-range reconnaissance and precision targeting. On paper, I was still logistics. In reality, I was crawling through enemy territory with a rifle that cost more than most people's cars. And the shot in Afghanistan? Sarah's expression grew serious. This was the part of the story she had never told anyone outside of her unit. We were supporting a forward operating base that was under attack. Taliban forces had positioned themselves in the mountains with heavy weapons. They were too far away for normal engagement, but they were devastating our guys. She paused, lost in the memory. I was positioned on a ridge with my spotter. We had been there for 18 hours waiting for the right opportunity. The shot had to be perfect, lives depended on it. What made it so difficult? Everything. The distance, obviously, but also the wind, the temperature, the altitude. At that range, you have to account for the rotation of the Earth. One small miscalculation and the bullet could miss by hundreds of yards. Jennifer shook her head in amazement. I can barely hit a target at 300 meters. It took 3 hours to set up the shot, Sarah continued. My spotter and I calculated everything multiple times. We had to wait for the wind to die down. The target kept moving. What happened when you fired? The flight time was over 6 seconds. 6 seconds where I didn't know if our guys would live or die. When the bullet hit, the enemy position went silent immediately. Their commander was down, and the attack fell apart. Sarah's hands were steady now as she spoke. This was her truth, and she was finally sharing it. My commanding officer said it was the finest shot he had ever seen. The incident was classified, but they couldn't ignore what I had accomplished. That's how I earned the Silver Star. Jennifer looked down at the medal again. Why don't you tell people about this? Who would believe me? A 62-year-old woman claiming to be one of the best snipers in military history? They'd think I was delusional. But you have proof. I have a medal and a story. But my service records are still classified. Officially, I was never a sniper. Officially, that shot never happened. Jennifer sat in stunned silence, staring at the Silver Star in its worn case. The coffee shop around them seemed to fade away as the weight of Sarah's revelation settled in. How many people know the truth? Jennifer finally asked. My unit commander knew. My spotter knew. A few people up the chain of command. Most of them are retired now, or... Sarah's voice trailed off. Or what? Or they didn't make it home. The sadness in Sarah's voice was unmistakable. Jennifer realized that this wasn't just about a remarkable military achievement. This was about loss, sacrifice, and the burden of carrying secrets that could never be fully shared. Your spotter, Jennifer said gently. What happened to him? Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson. He was killed in an IED explosion 6 months after Afghanistan. He was the only person who could verify every detail of that shot. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the glass case again, a gesture Jennifer was beginning to recognize as a way of finding comfort. Marcus used to joke that we were the best two-person team the military pretended didn't exist. He said someday we'd write a book about all the missions that never officially happened. Did you serve together long? 4 years. Marcus was from Detroit, had 2 kids. He taught me everything about wind reading and ballistics calculation. Without him, I never could have made that shot. Jennifer could see the pain in Sarah's eyes. Survivor's guilt was something she understood well from her own service. The hardest part, Sarah continued, isn't that people don't believe me. It's that Marcus isn't here to remember it with me. He was so proud of what we accomplished together. They sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the afternoon sun was starting to fade. The coffee shop was beginning to fill with the evening crowd, but their corner table remained peaceful. Sarah, why do you keep going to those veterans meetings? Those men are awful to you. Sarah looked out the window, watching people walk by on the street. Normal people with normal jobs who had never had to calculate bullet drop at extreme range or watch friends die in foreign countries. Because they're still my brothers in arms, even if they don't see me that way. We all served. We all sacrificed. Their service matters, even if they can't recognize mine. You're more generous than I would be. I wasn't always. For years after I retired, I was angry. Angry that my service was invisible. Angry that women like me had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously. Angry that Marcus died while jerks like Tom Bradley got to come home and brag about routine patrols. What changed? Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Time and perspective. I realized that my anger was eating me alive, but it wasn't changing anything. The men who mattered knew what I had done. The mission was successful. American soldiers came home because of that shot. That has to be enough. Jennifer admired Sarah's wisdom, but she could also see the cost of carrying such a burden alone. Have you ever thought about going public? There are journalists who specialize in military stories. They could verify your claims. With what evidence? My service records are classified. The mission details are classified. Even if a journalist wanted to investigate, they'd hit walls at every turn. But surely someone in the military would speak up for you. Sarah laughed, but it was hollow. The military doesn't like admitting it broke its own rules even when those rules needed to be broken. Confirming my story would mean acknowledging that women were in combat roles years before it was officially allowed. Jennifer was beginning to understand the impossible position Sarah was in. She was a war hero with no way to prove it, a groundbreaking soldier whose achievements had to remain secret. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. Something I haven't told you. What? The Taliban commander I killed with that shot. He wasn't just any commander. Intelligence later identified him as Hamid al-Rashid, one of their top tactical leaders. He was responsible for attacks that killed dozens of American and Allied soldiers. Jennifer's eyes widened. She had heard that name during her own deployment briefings. Al-Rashid had been a high-value target for years. Sarah, that makes your shot even more significant. Taking out al-Rashid probably saved hundreds of lives. I know, but it also makes the classification even more important. Revealing how al-Rashid died could compromise intelligence sources and methods. So you're protecting national security by staying quiet. In a way, yes. Even now, 15 years later, there are parts of that mission that can't be discussed. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of Sarah's situation. This woman had made one of the most remarkable shots in military history, eliminated a high-value enemy target, and saved countless lives. Yet she was forced to endure mockery and dismissal from people who couldn't imagine her courage. How do you stand it? Jennifer asked. How do you sit there while those men make jokes about your service? Some days are harder than others, Sarah admitted. But I remind myself that their opinion doesn't change what happened. That shot happened. Al-Rashid is dead. American soldiers are alive. The medal is real. She tapped the glass case gently. This case belonged to Marcus. His grandmother gave it to him before he deployed. He said it was for his most important possession. After he died, his family gave it to me with his personal effects. They wanted you to have it? Marcus had written a letter to be given to me if something happened to him. He said I should use his case to display my silver star, because he knew I would never do it otherwise. He said I earned the right to be proud. Jennifer felt tears forming in her eyes. He sounds like a good friend, the best. Marcus believed in me when no one else did. He fought for me to get the recognition I deserved even when it put his own career at risk. How so? Marcus was the one who insisted my commanding officer submit me for the Silver Star. Normally, they would have just noted the successful mission without naming individuals. But Marcus argued that exceptional service deserved exceptional recognition, regardless of gender or official job classification. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she talked about her friend's advocacy. He told our CO that if they were going to use female soldiers in combat roles, they had damn well better be prepared to honor their achievements. He said denying my medal would be worse than the enemy fire we faced. The coffee shop was getting busier as evening approached. Jennifer noticed other customers glancing at their table, probably wondering why two women were having such an intense conversation over what looked like an old display case. Sarah, I have to ask you something, Jennifer said. That shot you made, 200 meters, that's not just impressive for a woman. That's impressive for anyone. How did you develop that level of skill? Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. This was a question she rarely got to answer honestly. People think sniping is all about pulling the trigger, but that's maybe 5% of the job. The other 95% is mathematics, patience, and understanding your environment better than anyone else. What do you mean? At 200 meters, the bullet is in flight for over 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, everything can change. The wind can shift, the target can move. Atmospheric pressure can fluctuate. You have to predict what conditions will be like when the bullet arrives, not what they are when you fire. Jennifer tried to imagine the complexity involved. How do you even practice for something like that? You start small and work your way up. But more importantly, you study everything. Weather patterns, ballistics, the behavior of bullets at different altitudes and temperatures. I spent years reading technical manuals that most soldiers never even knew existed. Sarah paused to take a sip of her coffee, which had grown cold during their conversation. The military has sophisticated computer programs now that can calculate most of these variables automatically, but in 2010, especially in remote locations, you had to do a lot of the calculations by hand. Marcus and I would spend hours with slide rules and ballistics tables. Slide rules? That sounds ancient. Ancient but reliable. When your equipment fails in combat, you need to know how to do everything the old-fashioned way. Marcus used to say that technology could fail you, but mathematics never would. Jennifer was gaining a new appreciation for the technical complexity of long-range shooting. What was the most challenging part of that specific shot? Sarah's eyes grew distant as she remembered that day in the Afghan mountains. The elevation change. I was shooting from 8,400 feet above sea level down to about 6,200 feet. The bullet behavior is completely different at those altitudes. The air is thinner, which means less resistance, but it also means less predictable wind patterns. How long did you have to prepare? We'd been in position for 3 days observing the target area. We knew al-Rashid was in the region, but we had to wait for him to present a clear shot opportunity. On the morning of the actual engagement, Marcus woke me up at 4 a.m. Sarah's voice grew more animated as she recalled the details. Despite the pain of remembering, there was also pride in her technical achievement. Marcus had been monitoring the weather patterns all night. He said we had a window between 10 a.m. and noon, where the wind conditions would be optimal. But we had to be ready because the opportunity might only last minutes. What was going through your mind as you set up? Honestly? Calculations. Wind speed, temperature gradients, the angle of the sun, the rotation of the earth. At that distance, you even have to account for the Coriolis effect, the fact that the earth is spinning beneath your bullet. Jennifer shook her head in amazement. I had no idea it was so scientific. Most people don't. They see movies where snipers just point and shoot, but real long-range shooting is more like engineering than marksmanship. You're solving a physics problem where the wrong answer means people die. When did you actually take the shot? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, reliving that crucial moment. 4:47 a.m. Marcus had been watching al-Rashid through binoculars for 20 minutes. The target was moving between covered positions, but Marcus predicted he would pause at a specific point to observe the American base he was planning to attack. How could Marcus predict that? Experience and pattern analysis. We had been watching al-Rashid's forces for 3 days. Marcus noticed that he always did a personal reconnaissance before major attacks. He was a hands-on commander who didn't trust subordinates with important observations. Sarah opened her eyes and looked directly at Jennifer. At 11:47, al-Rashid emerged from cover exactly where Marcus predicted. I had been in firing position for 6 minutes, my crosshairs already aligned with that spot. When he appeared, I had maybe 15 seconds before he would move again. What happened in those 15 seconds? Time slowed down. I checked my calculations one final time. Wind speed, temperature, range estimate. Marcus whispered the final adjustments. Up 2 clicks, left 1. I made the adjustments and controlled my breathing. Sarah's hands moved unconsciously, as if she were still operating an invisible rifle. The shot felt perfect when I fired it. You know, sometimes when everything comes together exactly right? The rifle's recoil, the sight picture, the trigger break, everything was textbook perfect. Then what? Then we waited. 6.3 seconds to be exact. That's how long Marcus had calculated for bullet flight time. We couldn't see the impact through our scopes because of the distance and terrain, but we could see the effect immediately. What did you see? All activity around al-Rashid's position stopped. His security detail ran toward where he had been standing. Within minutes, they were carrying someone away on a stretcher. An hour later, their entire force began withdrawing from the area. Jennifer was completely absorbed in the story. How did you confirm it was actually al-Rashid? We didn't, not immediately. Our job was to eliminate the threat to the forward operating base, which we had accomplished. It wasn't until weeks later that intelligence confirmed the identity of the target through intercepted communications. The Taliban discussed it on radio. They were furious. Al-Rashid had been considered nearly untouchable because he was so careful about security. The fact that he had been eliminated from such an extreme range terrified them. They started assuming American snipers could reach them anywhere. Sarah smiled with satisfaction at this memory. Marcus said that was almost as important as the tactical victory. We had introduced an element of uncertainty that would affect their planning for months. Every Taliban commander would now have to wonder if they were in someone's crosshairs. Did you work with Marcus on other long-range shots? Several, but none at that distance. Our typical engagements were in the 1,500 to 2,500 meter range. Still challenging, but not historically significant. What made you such a good team? Sarah's expression softened as she thought about her fallen friend. Trust. Marcus never doubted my ability, and I never questioned his calculations. In that kind of work, hesitation kills people. We had trained together so extensively that we could communicate almost without words. The conversation was interrupted when Jennifer's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and saw a text message from her roommate asking when she'd be home. Looking around, she realized they had been talking for over 2 hours. The coffee shop was now busy with the dinner crowd. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said. "I completely lost track of time. This has been incredible." "You don't have to apologize," Sarah replied. "It's been nice to finally talk to someone about this." As they prepared to leave, Jennifer had an idea. "Sarah, would you be willing to meet with my friend Alex? He's a veteran too, and he works for the Veterans Administration now. He helps veterans get recognition for service that wasn't properly documented." Sarah looked hesitant. "I don't know. Like I said, most of my service is still classified. But maybe there's something he could do, or maybe he knows someone who could help. You deserve to have your service recognized properly." "What kind of recognition are you talking about?" Jennifer gathered her purse and coat, thinking carefully about how to explain. "There are programs now for veterans whose service was undervalued or overlooked, especially women veterans and those who served in unofficial capacities. Alex has helped several people get medals upgraded, or get proper recognition for classified missions." "How would that work?" "I honestly don't know all the details, but Alex does. He's helped people navigate the bureaucracy when their service records don't tell the full story." "Would you at least be willing to meet him?" Sarah picked up her glass case, holding it carefully as always. "I suppose it couldn't hurt to talk to him, but I don't want to get my hopes up." "Of course. No pressure. But I think you'd like Alex. He's good people and he understands the military better than most." They walked outside together. The sun was setting, and the street was busy with people heading home from work. Sarah looked smaller outside, Jennifer noticed. In the coffee shop telling her story, she had seemed larger than life. But on the sidewalk, she looked like what she appeared to be, an elderly woman carrying an old display case. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jennifer said as they walked toward their cars. "Sure. Why did you decide to tell me all this today? You said you've never shared the full story before?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment as they walked. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Because you didn't look at me like I was just someone's grandmother. When I mentioned my 16 years of service, you took me seriously. That doesn't happen often. Those men at the meeting are idiots. They're not idiots. They're just limited by their assumptions. They can't imagine that someone like me could have done what I did, so they don't even consider it as a possibility." They reached Jennifer's car first. Before getting in, Jennifer turned to face Sarah. "Those assumptions are their loss. What you accomplished is extraordinary by any measure. The fact that you're a woman just makes it more remarkable, not less. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. And Sarah, I think Marcus would be proud that you finally told someone." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "He always said I needed to learn to accept credit for my achievements. He said I was too modest for my own good. Smart man. The smartest, and the best friend I ever had." Jennifer got into her car but rolled down the window. "I'll call Alex tomorrow and set up a meeting if that's okay." "That's fine. But Jennifer, even if nothing comes of it, thank you for listening. It's been years since anyone really listened." As Jennifer drove away, she kept thinking about Sarah's story. A woman who had made one of the longest sniper shots in military history, eliminated a high-value terrorist target, and saved countless American lives. Yet she was dismissed and ridiculed by her fellow veterans. The next morning, Jennifer called Alex Martinez at his VA office. Alex was a former Army Ranger who had lost his left arm in Syria. He had transitioned into veteran advocacy work, and had become something of an expert in helping veterans navigate complex bureaucratic issues. "Alex, I need your help with something unusual," Jennifer said after they exchanged pleasantries. "Shoot. I met a veteran yesterday who has an incredible story, but nobody believes her. She has a Silver Star for a shot that would be historically significant, but her service records are classified." "Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more." Jennifer spent 20 minutes explaining everything Sarah had told her. Alex listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. "Jennifer, if even half of what you're telling me is true, this woman is a legitimate war hero. I believe all of it. Alex, you should see her when she talks about that shot. She knows technical details that nobody could fake. She understands ballistics and long-range shooting at a level that takes years to develop. The problem is proving it. If her records are classified, we can't just request them through normal channels. But there must be something we can do." Alex was quiet for a moment, thinking through the possibilities. "There might be. I know someone at the Pentagon who specializes in declassification requests. But it would take months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee of success." "What about the people she served with? Her commanding officers?" "That's actually our best bet. If we can find people who were there and are willing to speak on the record, that carries more weight than classified documents sometimes." Jennifer felt a surge of hope. She mentioned her unit commander recommended her for the Silver Star. That's huge. A commanding officer's testimony about a medal citation would be almost impossible to dispute. "Do you know if he's still alive?" She didn't say. "But Alex, there's something else. The Taliban commander she killed? It was Hamid al-Rashid." Alex went completely silent on the other end of the line. Jennifer could hear papers rustling and keyboard clicking. "Jennifer, al-Rashid was killed in 2010, but the circumstances were never made public. If your friend was responsible for that elimination, she's not just a war hero. She's responsible for one of the most significant tactical victories of the Afghanistan war." "Why is that such a big deal?" "Al-Rashid was brilliant. He was responsible for some of the most effective Taliban operations against American forces. His death marked a turning point in that region of Afghanistan. If we can prove your friend was the shooter..." Alex's voice trailed off as he considered the implications. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to move very carefully, but this could be bigger than just getting one veteran proper recognition. This could be about correcting historical records and honoring someone who has been invisible for too long." 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a small conference room at the Veterans Administration building. Her glass case rested on the table in front of her, and she felt more nervous than she had in years. Jennifer sat beside her for moral support, while Alex Martinez reviewed a thick folder of documents. "Sarah, I have to tell you, this has been one of the most interesting investigations I've ever conducted," Alex said, looking up from his papers. "What did you find?" Sarah asked quietly. "More than I expected and less than I hoped for. Let me start with the good news." Alex pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a man in military fatigues with captain's bars on his collar. "This is Captain James Morrison, your commanding officer in Afghanistan. He's now Colonel Morrison and he's stationed at Fort Bragg. When I contacted him about you, he remembered everything." Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the photograph. "Jimmy Morrison. I haven't seen him in 10 years. He spoke very highly of you. In fact, he said recommending you for the Silver Star was one of the proudest moments of his military career." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. After years of doubt and dismissal, hearing that her former commander remembered and respected her service was overwhelming. "Colonel Morrison provided me with detailed records he kept personally," Alex continued. "Technically, he wasn't supposed to keep copies of classified mission reports, but many officers do it anyway." "What kind of records?" Jennifer asked. Alex opened the folder and pulled out several photocopied pages. "After-action reports, personnel evaluations, and most importantly, his original recommendation for Sarah's Silver Star." He handed the papers to Sarah. Her hands shook as she read her own commendation, written in Morrison's precise handwriting 15 years ago. "Staff Sergeant Martinez demonstrated extraordinary heroism and technical proficiency under enemy fire," Sarah read aloud. "Her elimination of a high-value target at extreme range directly resulted in the preservation of American lives and disrupted enemy operations." "Keep reading," Alex encouraged. Sarah continued. The shot distance of 4,200 meters represents one of the longest confirmed eliminations in military history. Staff Sergeant Martinez's actions reflect the highest traditions of military service and deserve formal recognition despite the classified nature of her assignment. Sarah looked up at Alex with wonder in her eyes. He wrote all this? He wrote more than that. Colonel Morrison also documented his frustration with the military bureaucracy that prevented proper recognition of female soldiers in combat roles. Alex pulled out another document. This is from his personal journal, which he's given permission to use. Listen to this entry from October 2010. Alex began reading. Today I watched the finest soldier I have ever commanded make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. Staff Sergeant Martinez saved dozens of American lives with skill and courage that would be legendary if she were a man. The fact that her achievement must remain secret because of outdated policies makes me ashamed of the institution I serve. The room fell silent as the weight of Morrison's words sank in. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. He really wrote that? He did, and Sarah, there's more. Colonel Morrison has been working behind the scenes for years to get recognition for soldiers like you. What do you mean? Alex leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. There's been a quiet movement within the military to review cases of classified service that deserves public recognition. Colonel Morrison submitted your case as part of that review process. When? 2 years ago. The review board has been slowly working through cases, declassifying what they can and recommending public honors where appropriate. Jennifer grabbed Sarah's arm excitedly. Sarah, this is incredible news. But Sarah looked cautious. What's the bad news, Alex? You said there was less than you hoped for. Alex's expression grew somber. The al-Rashid elimination is still classified. The Pentagon won't confirm or deny the details of that operation, even with Colonel Morrison's testimony. So we can't prove the most important part of the story, not officially. But Sarah, here's the thing. We don't need to prove every detail. Colonel Morrison's documentation of your Silver Star in the 4,200-meter shot is sufficient to establish your credentials as one of the military's most skilled marksmen. Sarah considered this. After years of being dismissed, even partial recognition seemed almost too good to be true. There's something else, Alex continued. I reached out to the other members of your unit who are still alive. Sarah's head shot up. You found them? I found 3 of them. Sergeant First Class David Kim, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, and Specialist Robert Turner. They all remember you and they all confirm your reputation as the best shooter in the unit. You talked to David Kim? Sarah asked with excitement. How is he? He's doing well. He's retired now, living in California. But Sarah, he said something interesting when I asked about your shooting ability. What? Alex pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes. He said, and I quote, Sarah Martinez could hit targets that other people couldn't even see. We all knew she was special. But that shot in Afghanistan was something else entirely. I was there when she made it, and I still can't believe what I witnessed. Sarah gasped. David was there? I thought only Marcus and I knew the exact details. According to Kim, several members of your unit were providing security for the observation post. They couldn't see the target, but they saw you take the shot and they saw the effect it had on enemy operations. This is unbelievable, Jennifer said. Sarah, you have witnesses. It gets better, Alex said with a smile. All 3 of your former unit members have agreed to provide written statements supporting your service record. They want to see you get the recognition you deserve. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by this development. For years she had carried her memories alone, with only Marcus to share them. Now she was learning that other people remembered and valued her service. There's one more thing, Alex said carefully. This might be the most important development of all. He pulled out an official-looking letter with military letterhead. This arrived yesterday. It's from the Pentagon's Declassification Review Board. Sarah's heart raced as Alex handed her the letter. They're recommending your case for public recognition, not the specific details of the al-Rashid operation, but your overall service record and your Silver Star citation. Sarah read the letter twice before the words fully registered. They want to hold a ceremony? At the Pentagon. They want to honor you along with 12 other veterans whose classified service is being recognized publicly for the first time. Jennifer cheered and hugged Sarah, who was still staring at the letter in disbelief. But why now? Sarah asked. Why after all these years? Alex leaned back in his chair. Because times are changing. The military is finally acknowledging that some of their best soldiers were hidden because of outdated policies. They want to correct the historical record. And because people like Colonel Morrison never stopped fighting for soldiers like you, Jennifer added. Sarah looked down at her glass case, which had held her secret for so many years. Marcus would have loved this. Sarah, there's something else about the ceremony, Alex said gently. They want you to bring any personal items that represent your service. Maybe that case would be perfect. Sarah smiled through her tears. Marcus always said this case was meant for displaying achievements worth being proud of. He was right, Jennifer said firmly. And Sarah, this is just the beginning. Once your story becomes public, those men at the veterans meetings are going to feel pretty foolish. Sarah shook her head. I don't want them to feel foolish. I just want them to understand that service comes in many forms and courage doesn't always look the way they expect it to. Alex closed his folder and looked at Sarah with respect. In 6 weeks, you'll be standing in the Pentagon, receiving the public recognition you should have gotten 15 years ago. How does that feel? Sarah picked up her glass case and held it carefully as she always did. But for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding it protectively. She was holding it proudly. It feels like Marcus is finally going to get his wish, she said softly. He always wanted the world to know what we accomplished together. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 7 years. The uniform still fit perfectly, though she had needed Jennifer's help with the complicated arrangement of ribbons and medals on her chest. In her hands, she held Marcus's glass case, but now it contained more than just her silver star. Alex had helped her gather copies of her commendations, unit citations, and testimonials from her former teammates. The case had become a small museum of her hidden military career. The ceremony was smaller than she had expected, which suited her perfectly. About 50 people filled the room, mostly military officials, family members of the honored veterans, and a few carefully selected journalists. Sarah was one of 13 veterans being recognized for previously classified service. Colonel Morrison sat in the front row, having flown in from Fort Bragg specifically for Sarah's recognition. He was graying now and wore the eagles of a full colonel, but his smile was exactly as Sarah remembered it from Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, the ceremony began. Today we honor 13 American veterans whose extraordinary service was hidden from public view for reasons of national security. These men and women served with distinction in classified operations, and their achievements deserve recognition. Sarah's heart pounded as they worked through the list of veterans. Each story was remarkable. Special operations soldiers, intelligence operatives, and technical specialists who had served in the shadows for decades. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, the presenter finally announced, served with distinction in Operation Enduring, Freedom from 2008 to 2012. Her precision marksmanship and tactical expertise contributed to multiple successful missions in Afghanistan. Sarah walked forward on unsteady legs, still carrying her glass case. The presenter continued reading from her citation. Staff Sergeant Martinez achieved one of the longest confirmed eliminations in military history, a shot of 4,200 meters that neutralized a high-value target and saved American lives. Her technical skill and courage under fire exemplify the finest traditions of military service. The audience applauded, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about Marcus, wishing he could be there to share this moment. After the ceremony, people approached her with congratulations and questions. Several military historians wanted to interview her about long-range shooting techniques. A journalist from Military Times asked about her experiences as a woman in combat roles before they were officially allowed. But the most meaningful conversation came from an unexpected source. Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez? Sarah turned to see a young woman in army fatigues, probably in her early 20s. She wore the insignia of a second lieutenant and looked nervous about approaching. Yes, I am. Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Jessica Chen. I'm a sniper with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Sarah's eyes widened. Female snipers were still rare, even now that combat roles were officially open to women. I wanted to thank you, Lieutenant Chen continued. I've heard stories about female soldiers who served in combat roles before it was officially allowed. You and others like you made it possible for people like me to serve openly. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. This was recognition she had never expected, not from the military but from a young soldier who was following in her footsteps. How did you hear about me? Sarah asked. Colonel Morrison spoke at our training course last month. He told us about exceptional soldiers who had served in classified roles. He said there were women like you who proved themselves in combat, long before anyone was ready to acknowledge it officially. Sarah looked over at Morrison, who was watching their conversation with a proud smile. Lieutenant Chen, what's your longest confirmed shot? 850 meters, ma'am. I know it's nothing compared to what you accomplished. Every shot that saves American lives is important, Sarah replied gently. Distance is just a number. What matters is being there when your fellow soldiers need you. The young lieutenant beamed at this praise from someone she clearly considered a legend. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to hear her story. For the first time in years, she felt comfortable sharing details about her military service. The recognition ceremony had given her official permission to be proud of her achievements. Later that evening, Sarah attended a dinner with the other honored veterans and their families. Jennifer had flown in for the ceremony and sat beside her at the head table. How are you feeling? Jennifer asked quietly. Grateful, Sarah replied, and a little overwhelmed. You deserve all of this recognition and more. Sarah looked around the room at the other veterans being honored. Each had served their country in extraordinary ways, sacrificing recognition and glory for the greater good of national security. Jennifer, can I tell you something? Of course. This morning I called Marcus's mother in Detroit. I told her about the ceremony and what it meant. She said Marcus would have been so proud. What did she say about you finally getting recognition? Sarah smiled. She said Marcus always told her I was the best soldier he ever served with. She said he used to worry that people would never know what I had accomplished. Well, now they do. Some of them do, and that's enough. The formal dinner concluded with brief remarks from each honored veteran. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood slowly and looked out at the assembled crowd. 15 years ago, I made a shot that saved American lives. She began simply. I was able to make that shot because of my training, my equipment, and most importantly, my spotter and friend, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson. She paused, her voice growing stronger. Marcus died 6 months later, and for years I thought the story of what we accomplished together would die with him. Today I learned that true service is never really hidden. It lives on in the lives that are saved, the missions that succeed, and the soldiers who come after us. She held up Marcus's glass case. This case belonged to my friend Marcus. He said it was for displaying things worth being proud of. For 15 years I wasn't sure I had the right to be proud. Today I know that I do, not because of official recognition, but because of what that recognition represents. It represents every soldier who serves in the shadows, every mission that can't be discussed, and every sacrifice that goes unrecognized. The room erupted in sustained applause. Sarah sat down feeling lighter than she had in years. After dinner, as people began to leave, Colonel Morrison approached her table. Sarah, I owe you an apology, he said. For what, sir? For not fighting harder to get you recognition 15 years ago. You deserved better from the military you served so well. Sarah stood and shook his hand. Colonel, you fought for me when it mattered most. You made sure my achievement was documented even when it couldn't be publicized. That took courage too. What will you do now? He asked. Sarah looked at Jennifer, then back at Morrison. I think I'll go back to those veterans meetings. But this time, I won't be hiding what I accomplished. Good for you. As Sarah and Jennifer left the Pentagon that evening, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Her glass case was still in her hands, but she was no longer protecting it from judgment. She was carrying it with pride. Sarah, Jennifer said as they walked to their car, those men at the veterans meetings are going to be shocked when they find out the truth about you. Sarah smiled. I hope they'll be shocked in a good way. I hope they'll learn that courage and skill come in many forms and that everyone's service matters. What if they don't believe it even now? Sarah looked at the Pentagon building behind them, where her story was now part of official military history. Then that's their loss, she said confidently, because I know who I am. I know what I accomplished, and I know that Marcus would be proud. That's enough for me. 6 months later, Sarah was featured on the cover of Veterans magazine. The article, titled The Shot That Changed Everything, detailed her 4,200-meter elimination and its impact on operations in Afghanistan. The story became one of the most read articles in the magazine's history. At the next veterans meeting, Tom Bradley and Mike Stevens were waiting for her with sheepish expressions and genuine apologies. The ridicule had been replaced with respect, and Sarah's glass case was no longer an object of mockery, but a symbol of extraordinary service. Sarah had finally received the recognition she deserved, but more importantly, she had learned to recognize her own worth. Marcus's case would always hold her medals, but now it represented more than hidden achievements. It represented the courage to be proud of serving your country, no matter what form that service takes.